The gavel struck the bench with a deafening crack, sending a ripple through the courtroom. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery as the judge's sharp gaze scanned the room, demanding silence. In the witness stand, a man trembled, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a truth so dark it hung like a cloud over everyone. I didn't mean for it to happen," he stammered, eyes wide with terror. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their hands gripping the armrests in tension. One juror's coffee cup wobbled dangerously before toppling, spilling dark liquid across the floor. The defendant, pale and still, barely breathed, caught in the moment between guilt and innocence. The air was thick with anticipation, and the murmurs of the press grew louder, the story already forming in their minds. Outside the courtroom, the town gossip was already stirring the pot, whispering secrets into the ears of reporters, feeding the frenzy. The trial had only just begun, and already lives were teetering on the edge of ruin. The protagonist sat in the defendant's seat, his legs stiff with tension. His heart beat like a drum in his chest, every second feeling like an eternity. He had tried to maintain control, but now the pressure was unbearable. The room was filled with whispers, the sound like the buzzing of 1,000 angry bees. He could feel every gaze, every judgmental stare, boring into his back. He had been wronged, but the truth seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. It would be a miracle if he made it out of here with his name intact. His lawyer's words felt distant, lost in the noise around him. He was on the edge of breaking, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of self-doubt and fear. Would the truth be enough to save him? Or would the whispers be his undoing? As the trial pressed on, the walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in on the protagonist. Every word from the prosecutor hit like a hammer, each statement sharper than the last. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-featured man in his 50s, paced back and forth, his voice a steady stream of calculated accusations. "You knew what you were doing," he said, eyes fixed on the defendant. "You planned it all along." The defendant's throat tightened, the accusation echoing in his mind. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. The room seemed to grow colder, the tension so thick that it was suffocating. He glanced toward his defense attorney, hoping for a signal, some form of reassurance. But the attorney's face was as hard as stone. The jury's eyes were all on him, and the weight of their gaze felt like a crushing burden. He couldn't help but wonder, was it over? Had the prosecutor already won? The defense attorney rose to his feet, his expression as calm and composed as ever. He adjusted his glasses, then turned to face the jury with a slow, deliberate motion. His voice was measured, yet filled with a quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the prosecution has painted a picture, but it's a picture of lies. The truth is more complex than what they've led you to believe." The defendant felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a chance after all. The defense attorney paced, each step calculated, deliberate. "We will show you the truth," he continued, his eyes scanning the jury with intensity. "We will prove that my client is innocent. The evidence is clear. The only thing that's been manufactured here is the case against him." The courtroom was still, the air thick with the weight of the words. The defendant's heart skipped a beat as he allowed himself to believe for a moment that things might turn in his favor. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom as the town gossip, a woman in her 50s, leaned over to whisper to the reporter beside her. "You know," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "there's more to this story than anyone realizes. I've heard things no one wants to admit." The reporter's eyes widened, and she leaned in closer, eager for the scoop. The gossip's voice was filled with venom as she spoke, feeding the reporter's hunger for a scandal. "I know someone who saw him that night, saw him in the area, and it wasn't just coincidence." The reporter quickly scribbled down notes, her pen flying across the paper. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, as the seed of doubt was planted, another whisper in the wind. The defendant's fate was no longer in just the hands of the jury. The town's gossip had become a powerful force in shaping the narrative. The trial was far from over, but the damage had already begun. As the trial continued, The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, like a storm gathering strength. The prosecutor's words had sown doubt, and now the tension was palpable. Every glance, every murmur in the gallery seemed to weigh on the defendant. The jury, already split, exchanged looks, their eyes darting from the defendant to the witness stand. The young woman juror, the one who had appeared so confident at the start, now hesitated. She glanced at the defense attorney, searching for some sign of reassurance. The town gossip's words echoed in her mind. Was there truth to what she had heard? The idea that the defendant had been near the scene on that night, the night of the crime, lingered in her thoughts. She could feel the pressure mounting, and with every passing moment, the scales seemed to tip further away from the defense. The once hopeful air of the trial had shifted into something darker, more uncertain. The defense attorney, sensing the shift in the room, took a deep breath before rising. His voice, steady but urgent, cut through the mounting tension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his eyes scanning each of their faces. "What has been presented to you today is nothing more than a series of coincidences, distorted into something far more sinister." His words were measured, yet they carried a weight of urgency. He moved towards the center of the courtroom, his hand gesturing toward the defendant. "This man, my client, is innocent. The accusations against him are based on speculation and rumor, not facts." His tone softened slightly, emphasizing the need for the jury to look beyond the surface and see the truth. "I implore you to consider what we have shown you today. Evidence, witnesses, and a history that paints a very different picture." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze intense. "Do not let the voices of the outside world cloud your judgment. The truth is right in front of you." The town gossip's words were still fresh in the juror's mind. She had heard them again repeated, from a source she trusted. Could they be true? Did the defendant really have a connection to the crime scene, as she had been told? As the trial progressed, those whispers seemed louder. The more the prosecution pressed, the more her doubts grew. She had come in wanting to believe in the defendant's innocence, but now she wasn't so sure. She glanced over at the prosecutor, whose sharp features and confident demeanor seemed to reinforce the suspicion creeping in. Was it possible that the defendant had been involved in something more than he let on? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the mounting contradictions. Was she just imagining things? Or was the truth more complicated than it appeared? The weight of the decision before her felt unbearable, but she knew she had to choose: trust in the evidence or succumb to the whispers of doubt. The prosecution's next witness took the stand. A man in his late 30s with a scruffy beard and a tense expression. His eyes darted nervously between the defense attorney and the jury as he began his testimony. "I saw him," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw the defendant near the scene the night of the crime." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the words landed. The defendant's eyes widened, his pulse quickening. This was it, the moment the prosecution had been waiting for. The defense attorney stood, ready to cross-examine. "And what exactly did you see, Mr. Lawrence?" he asked, his tone sharp, probing. The witness faltered, his words becoming less certain. "Well, I saw someone who looked like him," he stammered. The defense attorney pressed harder, pointing out the inconsistencies in the witness statement. "So you can't be sure it was my client?" he asked. The witness hesitated, the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "No, I can't be sure." The jury watched, some with doubt creeping into their minds, while others seemed reassured. Outside the courtroom, the press had begun to spin the trial in their own direction. The town gossip had been busy, feeding the media sensational stories, and now the headlines were starting to reflect the rumors. "Defendant's connection to crime scene confirmed?" One headline read. "Witness links defendant to murder scene," another blared. The whispers of doubt had spread beyond the walls of the courtroom, infecting the public perception. The reporter, the same one who had spoken with the town gossip, sat in the corner of a cafe, typing furiously on her laptop. The public has already made up their minds, she thought, her fingers tapping away at the keys. What remains to be seen is whether the jury can separate the truth from the lies. The images of the trial flashed on the screen in front of her, the tension evident in every shot. She had her story, but it was one that could change everything. As she hit send, the truth felt farther away than ever. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as the defense attorney delivered his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the truth is simple. My client is innocent." His voice echoed through the room, but the air was thick with doubt. He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. "Yes, there are conflicting testimonies. Yes, the evidence is circumstantial, but none of it directly links my client to the crime." His eyes swept over the jury, each member silently weighing his words. "We have shown you that there is another possibility, that someone else may have been responsible. The prosecution has failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt." The defense attorney's tone softened, almost pleading. "I ask you to remember, doubt is not a weakness, it is a strength in our justice system. And today, you must hold on to that doubt to protect the innocent." He stepped back, letting his words hang in the air like a heavy fog. The prosecutor, calm but with an air of finality, stood up next. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have shown you everything you need to see. The defendant was at the scene. We have the witnesses, the evidence, and the motive." His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving the jury. "This is not about doubt. It is about the truth. The truth that you have seen laid out before you." He paced slowly across the floor, each step deliberate. "The defense wants you to believe that there is a reasonable doubt. But let me remind you that doubt does not equal innocence." His gaze locked onto the defendant, a calculated stare. "You must look at the facts, not the distractions." He turned back to the jury. "The defendant is guilty. It is as simple as that. I ask you to deliver justice today." As the trial dragged on, a new witness was called. He was a man in his 30s, with a rough appearance and unkempt hair. His testimony was shaky, but it carried an unexpected weight. "I saw him," the witness said, his voice low and uncertain. "I saw the defendant, the night of the crime, near the alley where it happened." The room fell silent as the jury leaned forward, hanging on every word. "But," the witness stammered, "I didn't see his face clearly. I can't be sure it was him." The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "So you're not sure?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The witness hesitated before nodding. "I can't be sure, but it looked like him." The room seemed to shift, the air thick with uncertainty. The defense attorney pressed on, unraveling the witness' shaky testimony, proving that it was based more on assumption than fact. The defense attorney, having successfully undermined the witness, turned to the jury. "What you've just heard is the perfect example of how unreliable this case is. A witness who cannot even say for sure what they saw." He moved to the center of the courtroom, pacing slowly. "We cannot convict a man based on someone's doubt, someone's shaky memory." His voice rose with intensity. "The prosecution wants you to believe their narrative, but it's based on nothing solid. No direct evidence, no clear link to the crime." He turned, locking eyes with each juror. "What you have before you is a case built on assumption, not facts." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "I ask you to look at the truth. And the truth is clear. My client is innocent." Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy had intensified. The town gossip had spun a new tale, one that painted the defendant in an even darker light. Was the defendant involved in a secret affair? One headline read, "Could this be the motive for the crime?" The questions kept mounting. In the heart of the courthouse, the defendant's lawyer was still fighting, but the damage was done. The defendant, sitting in the holding cell, could feel the weight of the rumors pressing down on him. His lawyer had assured him that the truth would come out, but with each passing day, the press was painting him as the villain. Every corner of the city was alive with whispers about him. He could barely keep his composure as he sat in the cold, dimly lit cell. What if the public believed the gossip more than the truth? What if it was too late? The air in the courtroom shifted as the defense attorney called his next witness, a woman in her early 30s, her face familiar but out of place. She stood with a confident yet nervous demeanor, her eyes glancing quickly toward the defendant. "I can confirm," she began, her voice steady, but with an underlying tremor, "that I was with the defendant the night of the incident. We were at the bar together for most of the evening." The room grew tense. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. The defense attorney, however, stood taller, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. The defendant, though, remained motionless, his gaze locked on the witness, unsure whether this new development would work in his favor. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every word. But the witness continued, her voice faltering slightly, "I didn't see him leave the bar." The defense attorney nodded, pressing forward. The pieces were falling into place, but how much of it would be enough to convince the jury? The prosecutor immediately stood, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "But you can't be sure, can you?" he asked, his eyes sharp and focused on the witness. "You never saw the defendant leave the bar, and yet you're suggesting that he couldn't have been involved." The witness faltered, but only for a moment. "I'm not suggesting anything," she replied, her voice slightly shaky. "I'm just saying what I saw." The prosecutor paced before the jury, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "What you saw was a man in a bar, surrounded by people. What you didn't see is just as important. You didn't see him leave, you didn't see him with the victim, and you didn't see him anywhere near the scene of the crime." The prosecutor turned back to the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. "So, what makes you think that your testimony should hold any weight?" The jury, already on edge, shifted in their seats, the prosecutor's words weighing heavily in the room. The defense attorney, sensing the precariousness of the situation, stepped forward with calm authority. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "The prosecutor is trying to undermine the witness' credibility without any grounds." The judge, an older man with glasses, nodded slightly. "Sustained," he said, his voice sharp, causing the prosecutor to pause. The room fell into an uneasy silence, and the defendant, still seated in the dock, allowed himself a small fleeting hope. The defense attorney turned back to the witness, his expression kind. "Let's be clear, you saw the defendant at the bar for several hours, correct?" The witness nodded, her voice quieter now. "Yes, I did. We were talking for most of the night." The defense attorney nodded. "Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor." The defense rested, and the room held its breath as the judge prepared to call the next phase of the trial. The room grew tense again as the prosecutor began his final cross-examination of the defense's star witness. "You're telling us you saw the defendant all night, but you didn't see him leave?" the prosecutor asked, his voice low, almost mocking. The witness hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice small. "I didn't see him leave." The prosecutor's eyes hardened. "And how do we know that you didn't miss something?" he asked, his tone sharp. "How do we know you weren't distracted, or that you didn't misunderstand something?" The witness shrank back slightly, but then her voice strengthened. "I know what I saw. I'm sure." The tension in the room reached its peak, the jury sitting on edge, unsure of what to believe. The defense attorney shot a look at the prosecutor, but remained silent, knowing the damage had already been done. As the trial drew to a close, the defense attorney stood for his closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice filled with conviction, "we have shown you that the prosecution's case is full of holes." He paced in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "We have shown you that the witness testimony is uncertain, and that there is no direct evidence linking my client to the crime." He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the jury. "This case is about doubt, not guilt. And in this country, we do not convict based on doubt. We convict based on the truth." He turned back toward the defendant, his expression softening slightly. "And the truth, Your Honor, is that my client is innocent." The room was still, the words hanging in the air as the defense attorney took his seat, his eyes locked on the jury. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension, as the defense attorney prepared for his closing argument. "This trial has been filled with contradictions," he began, his voice steady, but with a trace of emotion. "We've heard testimony after testimony, each more confusing than the last. But what remains unshaken, what remains unbroken, is the truth that my client is innocent. He paced slowly in front of the jury, his eyes focused, unwavering. The prosecution's case is built on assumptions, not facts. We cannot convict a man based on doubts or theories. The defendant, seated in the dock, watched with intensity, his heart racing. You have heard no direct evidence tying my client to the crime, the attorney continued. What you have heard is a web of lies, twisted into something that suits the narrative they wish to tell. But the truth is clear, and it is up to you to see it. The defense attorney stopped, his gaze sweeping across the jury. I ask you to do what is right. Do not let this trial become a verdict based on fear, on doubt, or on the loudest voice in the room. Let it be based on truth. The truth that my client is innocent. The prosecutor stood with a quiet confidence as he prepared to deliver his rebuttal. The defense has painted a picture of doubt, a picture that has no place in this courtroom, he said, his voice calm but stern. What we have is the truth, undeniable and clear. He turned to face the jury, his eyes locked on them, challenging them to see what he saw. We have the evidence, the witnesses, and the motive. We have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. His words hung in the air like a weight. There is no doubt here, no question left. The defendant was at the scene. The defendant committed the crime. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. We do not convict based on speculation. We convict based on the facts. And the facts are clear. Justice must be served, and it is your duty to ensure it is. As the trial neared its climax, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The defense attorney had made his case, but the prosecutor's rebuttal had left everyone on edge. The jury was deliberating, but outside the courtroom, whispers were already swirling. The press was full of speculation, and the town was divided. People were taking sides, some believing in the defendant's innocence, others convinced of his guilt. The town gossip, always eager to stir the pot, was already whispering into reporters' ears, painting a dark picture of the defendant's past. The tension outside the courthouse was almost palpable. The defendant, now sitting in the holding cell, could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. His thoughts raced as he tried to prepare for whatever verdict was coming his way. His future was uncertain, and the weight of the trial, the media frenzy, and the pressure from all sides threatened to crush him. The jury returned to the courtroom, their faces unreadable. The foreman stood, his hand gripping the paper that would seal the defendant's fate. The room was filled with a tense stillness as everyone waited for the verdict. The judge, his expression solemn, turned toward the jury. Have you reached a verdict? He asked. The foreman nodded, standing tall. We have, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady. The room held its breath as the judge motioned for the foreman to speak. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of all charges. The words hung in the air like a hammer falling. The defendant's face went pale, his heart sinking. He had known this moment might come, but hearing it out loud made it real. The weight of the conviction settled in. The defense attorney's face was hard to read, his emotions hidden behind a professional mask. The prosecutor's lips barely twitched in satisfaction, but inside, the victory felt hollow. The courtroom emptied, leaving only the defendant and his defense attorney. The weight of the verdict hung heavily in the air. I didn't do it, the defendant whispered, his voice barely audible. His defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort, but even he knew that the battle was far from over. We'll appeal, the attorney said, though his voice lacked conviction. We'll keep fighting. This isn't the end. But the defendant wasn't sure anymore. The trial, the witnesses, the media, it had all taken its toll. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of lies, and now the truth seemed further away than ever. He looked up at his attorney, eyes filled with uncertainty. What if there's no way out, he asked. What if we've already lost? The defense attorney didn't answer right away. He just squeezed the defendant's shoulder, a silent promise that the fight would continue, even if the outcome was uncertain. The courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with anticipation, as the judge prepared to announce the verdict. The defendant sat motionless in the dock, his eyes focused on the judge, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent months in this nightmare, unsure if the truth would ever come to light. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now the final moment had arrived. His defense attorney stood beside him, his posture tense but composed. "We've done all we can," the attorney whispered under his breath, but his words felt hollow. The defendant didn't respond. He didn't have the strength. His mind was a blur, filled with memories of the trial and the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on him. The judge lifted his gavel, and the room fell into complete silence. "The jury has reached a verdict," the judge said, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Every person in the room, whether jury or spectator, was holding their breath, waiting for the words that would decide the defendant's fate. The judge's voice echoed in the silence. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, and the defendant's heart raced, and his hands trembled at his sides. It felt like time was stretching, every second dragging on for eternity. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and the anticipation had reached a fever pitch. The prosecutor sat in the front row, his expression unreadable, but his jaw was clenched tight. The defense attorney stood beside the defendant, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Guilty," the judge finally said, and those words hit the defendant like a physical blow. The air seemed to drain from the room. A low murmur began to ripple through the spectators, but the defendant barely heard it. His world had just shattered in front of him. The truth seemed so far away, and the weight of the conviction was crushing. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but it felt like nothing more than a distant gesture. All he could think about was the sound of the words "guilty" echoing in his mind. The room seemed to spin as the defendant's fate was sealed. The judge ordered the defendant to be taken into custody, and the moment the gavel struck, the air was filled with the sound of footsteps. The defendant's attorney was already standing, but the defendant couldn't move. His mind was reeling, the verdict echoing in his head. "We'll appeal," his attorney whispered, though the words sounded distant, as if spoken from another world. The defendant nodded but felt no hope. The press, the media, and the town had already made their decision, and now the truth felt like a fading dream. The defendant was led away, his body limp, as if the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. Outside the courtroom, the whispers of the media grew louder. The town had chosen its side, and the defendant was no longer the man they once knew. Outside, the media frenzy was already in full swing. Reporters clamored for interviews, and cameras flashed as the defendant's name was spoken with contempt. The town gossip had already spread rumors of the defendant's supposed guilt, further fueling the public's perception. As the defendant was led into the police van, he could hear the questions shouted at him, though his mind was too numb to process them. "Is it true you're guilty?" a reporter yelled. "How does it feel to be convicted?" Another voice shouted. The defendant kept his head down, ignoring the questions. The press had already decided, and no matter what he said, it wouldn't change their story. His attorney had promised an appeal, but the fight now seemed endless. The weight of the conviction pressed down on him. He could only imagine how the public would continue to vilify him. The town had already sentenced him long before the jury ever did. The defendant sat in his cell, the walls closing in around him. The cold steel of the bars seemed to mock him, and the silence of the cell felt like a cruel reminder of the world outside that had moved on without him. He couldn't stop thinking about the trial, about the testimony, the witnesses, the lies. How had everything gone so wrong? His future, his reputation, everything he had worked for, it was all gone. "I'm not guilty," he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. His attorney had promised an appeal, but in the silence of the cell, he couldn't believe it would make a difference. The world outside had already judged him, and no matter how many appeals they filed, it didn't change the fact that his life had been destroyed. The truth seemed further away than ever, and the weight of the conviction was crushing. The courtroom was quieter than ever. The defendant, his shoulders slumped, entered through the back door. His attorney had promised hope, but the weight of the verdict still felt like an anchor around his neck. His mind kept replaying the trial, the accusations, the witnesses, and the media storm that followed. "I've lost everything," he thought, his heart heavy with regret. The attorney stood by him, but words of comfort felt distant. The courtroom's coldness seemed to mirror the emptiness inside him. The once vibrant man had become a shadow of himself, struggling to accept the harsh reality. The future seemed uncertain, and for the first time he wondered if redemption was even possible. Could he recover from the damage? The room was filled with whispers, but all he could hear was the deafening silence of his own mind. The town gossip's words echoed in the defendant's mind. "This trial isn't just about the truth," she had said. "It's about public opinion." The courtroom had been full of spectators, their eyes judging every word, every movement. Outside, the press was already churning out stories. It didn't matter what the defendant's attorney argued, or what evidence was presented. The narrative had already been shaped by those outside the courtroom. The whispers of the town were louder than the truth. The defendant sat in the holding cell, his hands gripping the metal bars, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of doubt. What could he do now? The media frenzy had only intensified since the verdict, and the town had already sentenced him. His life was no longer his own. It had been taken over by the lies and speculation that painted him as a criminal. The reality was inescapable. As the media frenzy grew, the defendant realized that no matter what happened next, the truth had already been distorted. The public had made up their mind, and the press had already built its narrative. His life, his reputation, had been torn apart. Even the appeal process felt like a hollow gesture. What if it didn't change anything? What if he remained trapped in the web of rumors and half-truths spun by the media? His defense attorney assured him they had a strong case for appeal, but those words felt less comforting now. The walls of his cell seemed to close in, the reality of his situation pressing down on him. The anger inside him was building, but he wasn't sure where to direct it. The system, the media, or the people who had condemned him. He didn't know anymore. What mattered now was survival. Was there any hope left? In the midst of the chaos, a phone call came through. The one piece of good news the defendant had been waiting for. His estranged daughter, whom he hadn't seen in years, wanted to speak to him. He hadn't expected it. Her words were shaky, unsure, but there was a hint of hope in her voice. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said, "but I need to know if you're really the man the papers say you are." It was a simple question, but it cut deep. The defendant didn't know how to answer. His past had been clouded with lies, but the one person who mattered most to him had believed in him once. Was there any hope left for their relationship? Could he clear his name and prove he wasn't the monster the media had painted? The phone call ended abruptly, leaving the defendant with 1,000 questions. As the days passed, the weight of the verdict lingered, but so did the small flickers of hope. The defendant had lost everything, but in the silence of his cell, he realized he still had something. The chance to fight for the truth, even if the world had already decided his fate. The legal process would continue, but he was no longer just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for redemption. Every letter he wrote, every conversation with his attorney was a small step toward reclaiming his life. The media, the public, and even his own doubts had chipped away at him, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. His fight was no longer just for himself, but for the people who still believed in him. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but he would face it with a quiet determination. Redemption might be a distant hope, but it was still a hope worth holding on to.